Yesterday, I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today, I'm wise, so I'm changing myself.
What about tomorrow?
Technology is here before we expect it, and the best way for us to take the next step and create the future of health and medicine is to go and create it ourselves.
How?
Let's journey into tomorrow and beyond.
Welcome back to Health Beyond Tomorrow. Today I'm joined with Neil Daly, CEO and founder of Skin Analytics. I was inspired by Neil's story and his company after I met him at the Intelligent Health AI conference a couple months back in London. We dive deep into how Skin Analytics is leveraging AI technology to revolutionize dermatological diagnosis, specifically in the context at the moment of skin cancer. Neil shed some light on the pivotal role of AI, computer vision and machine learning in the field of dermatology. With Skin Analytics at the forefront of this push, they leverage their advanced AI algorithms to provide accessible and reliable diagnostic tools that empower both patients and clinicians alike. So Neil discusses the challenges of integrating AI into the clinical practice pathway, addressing common fears and misconceptions. He passionately emphasized that AI is not a threat to health professionals, but rather a powerful aid that can help improve patient outcomes and alleviate the burden on overstretched healthcare systems. Neil shares some inspiring insights on the future of healthcare technology and offers invaluable advice for aspiring entrepreneurs seeking to make a difference in the industry. So as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you hit that follow button, give the episode a like rating, give me a follow on Spotify, YouTube and Apple Podcasts, and make sure you share this conversation with as many friends as possible. I'm thrilled to be a part of this discussion with Neil, and I'm excited to bring you guys along. Let's get into it. You started a long time ago, right? 12 years ago. A lot of the tech and innovation that we're seeing now around AI, this is all new. This wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. And so you initially having started out with this idea, you've grown with this technology that's coming into practice. So tell me a little bit about your journey and some milestones and challenges that you've had to overcome.
In fact, funny little anecdote for me anyway, is that I remember very clearly in 2015, coming back to the team and saying, okay, we're going to start using this term artificial intelligence because everyone's getting really excited about it. It's the term that we'll use from now on so that people understand what it is that we do. Because before that, we were referring to computer vision, to a bunch of other machine learning, to a bunch of other names that were very much researcher-led and not at all well understood or well known. And there was a bit of pushback because AI was a buzzword and people were, do we want to be a buzzy company or do we want to be more accurate by saying computer vision or machine learning? Because AI is such a general term. And so I just remember it very clearly. It was a big internal debate and it was a good 2 years, 3 years after we started the company before we even started talking about artificial intelligence. And I think I'll go back to a little bit about the story in the past, but I was chatting to one of my team, my head of AI, Jack, and he was pointing out that there's been a bit of a pushback to this idea of artificial intelligence. There's almost two warring camps around AI at the moment. But he pointed out that one of the researchers in the field was asked about AI, like, what does AI mean? And their response was, AI is just a mistake in wording that was made in the 1960s. So this concept of artificial intelligence is probably not the most accurate way to describe what we do. It's very much applied statistics. But despite that, it's been a hugely exciting journey, an interesting journey right from the earliest days. So I think where I started was really from the problem. I grew up in Australia and we were exposed to a lot of sunlight and poor use of sunscreen. And we used to have rules that we weren't allowed to go out into the playground unless we had a hat and sunglasses during breaks when I was in school. And so I've grown up with this messaging around skin cancer and this huge sun exposure and just realized that for me, it was a really interesting field because it's all visually diagnosed initially or visually assessed initially. And there was this massive shortage of dermatologists that has been around for the last 20 years. And just felt like a really good opportunity to start applying some of this computer vision stuff that I've been reading about into healthcare and find a way to do things more efficiently. And that was back in 2011, 2012, and we were massively over-optimistic about how good the technology was back then, and we were completely wrong. But we were able to do enough interesting things over the couple of years for the technology to start maturing And then really we were first amongst many to start adopting the deep learning techniques, which are so powerful now and underpin a lot of what we do. And really it was the step change in the performance of the AI. So very much a problem, then tried to find the technology to fix it, and then tried to get people to believe that it was possible back at a time where it wasn't very fashionable. So it was a bit of a tricky journey.
Yeah. And your slogan, so I've obviously been emailing you over the last couple of weeks just so we can set up a date, and it says underneath your slogan, it says helping more people survive skin cancer. And so I think I wanted to start off this podcast with just asking you, how are you doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's very much the sort of aspirational goal of us as a company to try and get to that point. And when we started, again, looking at it from a problem point of view, you've got a lot of people who need to be assessed for skin cancer. The pickup rate is quite low, as with any cancers. And so there's a huge demand and a shortage of resources to do it. And what that results in is that patients sometimes take too long to get through the system to get the diagnosis. Skin cancer, like any cancer, the longer it has to get hold of you, the worse the outcomes are for you as a patient. And so really speeding up that time to assess patients is a way for us to help more people survive skin cancer. But ultimately, objective as a company are multi-phased. The first thing that we want to do is really help the existing patient pathways, help clinicians in those existing patient pathways be more efficient with their time. And we can talk a little bit more about what we're doing on that front with the NHS right now. Longer term, I have ambitions to try and prove that the value or the health economics around skin cancer screening is dramatically different when you can use a technology like skin analytics. And the goal is to then, if we can prove that economics is more feasible, we can try and start up national screening programs to be able to prove that skin cancer assessments are worthwhile doing and ultimately result in less people dying from cancer. And like all cancers, as I mentioned, it gets worse over time, but unlike most cancers in its earliest stages, it's visible on the surface of the skin and the survival rates are almost perfect. So there's a real opportunity for using this technology to go out and proactively find people, get the right people into care, and then result in no one dying from skin cancer. And that's very much what we're focused on. And it's a long journey. We're still at the beginning of it, despite being around for quite a while, but it's pretty exciting to be at the forefront of that.
So tell me a little bit how the technology has evolved, because I guess AI, obviously everyone seems to be an AI expert these days since the release of GPT and these other large language models. But what makes skin analytics and its algorithm different? Is it the fact that you guys have a unique set of database, a diverse database, or is it actually the algorithm which the AI model has been trained on?
It's been a while since I've talked about classical machine learning, but when we started the company, the way you approached the problem was you're effectively using algorithms to try and optimize weights of a formula, basically. And what I mean by that is you would identify the different things that are important for an algorithm to look at and to measure, and then it would optimize the weighting for each of those variables to try and get the best results in terms of a diagnostic test. So specifically, when we're looking at skin cancer, you'd be saying how irregular is the lesion and how do we codify that so that we can measure it, and then how many different colors are in this lesion, and a whole bunch of sort of characteristics which were descriptive of things like melanoma and other skin cancers. And it was quite funny in that phase, because what you had to do was really tell the algorithm what to measure. You had to really understand the problem. And so I was going out to speak to loads of dermatologists and I was saying, tell me how you know this is a skin cancer. And people were responding saying, it just looks a bit funny. I was like, I can't codify that. Why does it look funny? And it really showed how intuitive medicine becomes. And I remember speaking to a researcher in Australia who wanted to do a paper basically evaluating whether or not teaching clinicians the ABCDEs or the dermoscopic features was more or less effective than just giving them a bunch of data saying this one's good, this one's bad, and have the clinicians learn from practice about what is good and bad. And his theory was that actually you'd find that learning by doing was much more effective than learning the rules. But it certainly, when I was speaking to dermatologists, it was very hard to try and codify what it was that people were worried about. So that made it very challenging for us to measure them. And we had 150 odd features we ended up measuring, and it worked okay. But then came the sort of deep learning phase, which is where you're able to give a lot of data and labels to an AI set of algorithms, and it's able to learn itself. It pulls apart the images, measures a whole bunch of things. It does this in many different layers of abstraction, which are very hard to understand for us as humans. But effectively, it's pulling out the information that is relevant for something being skin cancer or melanoma in this case versus not. And then if you give it enough data in the right way, it's able to then start to learn and predict on its own right. And then you can evaluate how good it is in clinical study or in various other settings. And to your point, I think one of the interesting parts about that is that one, it makes people a little bit uncomfortable because it's a bit of a black box in some respects. And you can find out more information about how it works. But at some point, and I feel very strongly about this, what you should be focused on is the evidence of how well it works rather than understanding exactly how it works. And we've done that in a range of drugs and a range of different things. We don't know exactly the action of how it works, but we know the effects of it empirically. And that's where we should definitely focus. But to come back to your question around the data sets, one of the things that we had to make a decision on early was the deep learning models to date, actually, they still predominantly are set up like this, were designed to be trained on very large data sets. And the deep learning models were designed to be answering a different problem from what we were trying to solve. So they were set up originally to say, there's this set of, I think it's about 1 million or 2 million images that Stanford set up called ImageNet, and they were all trying to correctly label them in a competition to see how good these deep learning systems were. And so they were building these very big networks that were distinguishing between a stop sign and a dog and a burrito and all sorts of things that are interesting to be able to differentiate between. But it created these monster networks that were huge. And then when you get something like skin cancer and you put it in there, there's only so many degrees of freedom between a benign lesion and a melanoma as an example. And these networks were just too big and they needed so much data and they just didn't generalize very well. They effectively memorized the data that you could train them with because you needed a lot more of it. So we decided that we were going to throw that away, and we started from the ground up and we built our own networks that were specifically tailored to work with much smaller data sets, but also require those data sets to be very high quality. So we insisted that we'd only work with dermoscopic images. We insisted that we would have histopathology outcomes for all of our malignancies and a whole bunch of other parameters that really made getting hold of the data challenging. But the flip side was we could get away with using a lot less data to train the algorithm. And 5 or 6 years of development down that pathway, the proof is in the pudding with how our systems work. But it was a really important decision that we made back in sort of 2016 time to do that. And it's really been important for us.
And I think historically as well, there has been somewhat a lack of racial inclusivity in dermatological data sets. And having done my dermatology placement now in 4th year at university, this was now starting to be emphasized that, you know what, a lot of images in the textbooks are predominantly people with fair skin, showing skin lesions of people who are a Caucasian ethnicity, and now there's a shift in education to make sure that students are getting taught what skin lesions look like on people with darker skin, brown skin. And there's the release of the Mind the Gap handbook as well, which was released by a student, which shows an inclusivity of all different skin tones for the same conditions. And so tell me, how has skin analytics worked in overcoming this discrepancy to maintain that there's always accurate results across all different skin colors?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that is rightly very topical at the moment and has been for the last year or so, a real focus for people. A couple of things first. I think from our point of view, the first thing to recognize is that there's a very significant difference in outcomes right now between ethnic minorities and white patients. So I think that I just posted yesterday, having found this in a research report, that the survival rate, 5-year survival rate for Black patients is about 70% compared to 92% for white patients. And that's in the US where this data came from, but it was the first data that I've seen that actually had some hard numbers against it. And they identified there was a bunch of factors for that. One was the prevalence of disease and the type of disease. And we'll come back to that one because that's inherent in the disease, which is something that is very difficult for us to resolve. But they also pointed out that there's lack of education for patients, lack of education for clinicians, and then lack of access to care were the 3 main reasons that they saw this disparity between the performance of clinical care right now. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we're better when it comes to designing these AI systems, that we don't recreate the problems that we have now. Because the first thing to recognize is that we're not doing that right now. There's more we need to do. And then the second one is to make sure that we do better with the next generation of systems that we deploy. So that is definitely something that we've been focused on for quite a long time now. One of the challenges that we all have in this field is that the prevalence of skin cancer is about 30 times higher on white skin. So you can actually measure the drop in skin cancer incidence as the skin gets darker. There's a direct relationship there. So whiter skin has less protection to the sun. The results are worse when they're exposed to a lot of sunlight. So that means that there's a lot less darker skin types that are diagnosed with skin cancer, which is fantastic. But it also means it's very hard to collect a statistically significant amount of data. So what we've been doing, we've been working on this for a long time now. We've been doing a bunch of initiatives where we're making sure that the system is robust to different skin tones. We're trying to get enough validation data now to show that does work. We haven't got enough to statistically significantly be able to show that, but we are able to do is show that the performance of the system doesn't seem to be varying by Fitzpatrick skin type in our live deployments. We're also deployed in some of the most diverse parts of the UK, so we've been collecting data from those parts, and we hope to have enough. As soon as we do, we'll be publishing it. But we do make a commitment to make sure that we publish all of the data in terms of what we have now, even though it's not statistically significant. And the system is performing really well on darker skin tones. But again, because we don't have enough data to be certain about it, the confidence intervals on the performance are so big, we're not yet going out and talking about it. But I think it's a rightly contentious issue to make sure that we do better, because we can see that the data says that we haven't done very well so far as an industry at making sure that racial and ethnic differences don't end up affecting people's outcomes.
Sure. And I'm interested also, where would you say the value of skin analytics lies? Is it specifically the data that is being collected, or specifically the AI algorithm? Or are they equally as important?
Yeah, I think we're obviously very proud of the algorithms that we've built and how we built them. We've got a lot of innovation in the way that we've taken those models and built them out, both in the evaluation of skin lesions, but also in the way we follow up and do post-market surveillance to make sure that it is working, and the checks and balances we have in place to make sure there's no algorithmic drift happening and all those sorts of things that people worry about. That said, the data sets are incredibly important, and the more time that we operate a system, we've been live since 2020, April 2020. So we now have assessed more than 38,000 patients using the AI, and we have outcome data for a very good chunk of those. Because we're collecting the data, we're collecting the labels, we're able to validate in a way that we weren't able to with outside people, with other data sets that we didn't generate. So that's been exceptionally useful to us to keep evolving and improving what we do. But I'd like to say that the data sets are probably the less important part of it. There's a lot of emphasis put on data, and it's the lifeblood of AI, but it's wrong to think that if you just have the data, you can just click your fingers and you'll get the AI. It's a very long, complex task to go from having a research paper that says you get these fantastic results on a data set into a product that actually works in the real world. So I'd say definitely the algorithms are weighted more heavily in my view.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that as well, because traditionally medical device regulatory processes, they're not used to dealing with software at all or AI algorithms, and there's had to be a change now going forward. So how was that process in terms of jumping through the hurdles to making sure that you could use this AI algorithm clinically?
Yeah, it's been a very difficult process, and that's not down to the regulators per se. There's been a lot of change in the regulatory regime. There's been a lot of turmoil with the various regulatory bodies that will be in effect in the UK. There's been an ambition to make some changes. And obviously, regulators have a very difficult job of trying to figure out how to make something safe across an entire category. So they've gone from medical devices being physical things, which have very strict controls, how they're managed, into software, which happened exceptionally quickly. And then artificial intelligence is a specific type of software that is very unique and creates its own challenges. And so there's a lot of work for regulators to do around the world to get on top of it. We've been invested really heavily in regulation for a while. This is something that I'm particularly proud of as a team. We decided that we were going to lean into regulations at a very early stage. And at the time, everyone thought you could skirt under the radar if you were careful about it, and you didn't need to necessarily have the regulatory approval. You could find loopholes because AI wasn't appropriately covered by the regulations. And we decided that wasn't really the philosophy of our company, and that we didn't want to be doing that. And we realize that regulatory controls are incredibly important because they really are designed to, they make your system better. Having to meet those regulations undoubtedly make your system better. It's a lot harder. You spend a huge amount of time building the technology. The AI development took a number of years, but the code base is relatively small. The code base that sits around it to make it a medical device has 6,000 pages of documentation that supports it. It's a huge bit of work to do it. But at the end of it, you have, in our case, testing all the way through the stack so that we know that everything works. It's very difficult for something to go wrong in our system without us knowing about it. And we've got all the sort of safety controls and checks that are running constantly on it. So it has been a very difficult process. And on top of that, the European approach, the UK approach, and the US approach are all divergent and diverging. There's plans to pull them back together, but we've been operating under all of those and designing our systems to be appropriate for all the different regulatory regimes, which is in itself a challenge. But at the end of the day, we're talking about cancer, we're talking about patients' lives, and from our perspective, the regulations getting more stringent is probably appropriate. We have seen some companies with very light touch regulatory oversight doing things that we think are probably a little bit challenging when it comes to skin cancer in terms of making educational recommendations, which everyone takes as a sort of diagnosis, which is slightly problematic. So we're a big fan of regulatory processes, even though they're definitely hard work.
I think with discussing any AI software, specifically in the context of healthcare settings, it is reassuring to hear that the regulatory requirements are getting a bit more strict. So in terms of ethical considerations, when it comes to AI, specifically in integrating AI in clinical practice, that there's a lot of things to consider. And I think if I was in your position, or I think if anyone was in your position, does it ever affect you that the fact that the algorithms that your company has trained that are being integrated in clinical practice could potentially miss out on something that is life-threatening to a patient?
Absolutely. You know what? We had to confront that when we started building the medical device, because having clinicians in the company, they're trained, or maybe not trained, that's not fair. I don't believe you do get training, but you're expected to deal with the fact that you make decisions that
somewhat more prepared. More prepared.
And you probably don't have very good formal networks around you. I understand that the UK is maybe not so great at that part, but you do have the informal networks of other clinicians who've gone through that journey, have made decisions, it's ended badly for a patient, and have had to support each other in that sort of process. Engineers, AI researchers never had to consider that. And we had a moment as a company where we were going through the regulatory processes and thinking through, this is going to impact patients and we're going to make mistakes because the system isn't 100% sensitive. And neither are clinicians, and we think that what we do makes a real positive impact, but there are going to be people who don't get the right outcome, and we're going to be part of that. And that was a very difficult moment for everyone in the company to think through and say, what's my role in this and how do I feel about that? And in particular, our head of AI, Jack, I mentioned it before, he took that quite hard and he felt very conflicted about that. And ultimately where we got to is we think about things from a public health point of view. And so we're looking at statistics all the time. And statistically, we know that at the end of the day, using this technology is going to improve the outcomes for more patients. And that's because clinicians are in short supply and getting access to them is challenging. It's because primary care doctors don't get the same level of training in endoscopy and detecting skin cancer, and that the AI system is performing at a very high level these days. And so that's a way that we've been able to build the sort of comfort around it. But it was a real notable moment in the company's existence where we had to sit down and say, okay, as a company, how do we feel about this and how are we going to handle it as a group? And we have mental health first aiders and a bunch of work that Dan, our medical director, does to make sure that people in the company feel supported. But it is definitely something that was outside the ordinary for us as a company.
Statistics are good, right? And they clearly show that the AI models are a lot better than the clinicians right now in practice. Your study that you released in 2021 showed that there is around a 98 to 100% sensitivity in detecting skin cancers in comparison to clinicians who are on the front line and with an estimated sensitivity of around 92%. But at the end of the day, medicine isn't mathematical. Medicine is a vocation, right? And it comes down to the psychological aspect of, is a patient going to be happy if an AI algorithm got their diagnosis wrong in comparison to a doctor making a human mistake. So how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, first things first, you'll forgive me for being a little bit cautious on how we talk about the AI, because I think one thing that has never been done in any study is really directly compare clinicians in real world situations to artificial intelligence. And I suspect that while on paper what we did was show the performance of the system and then did a meta-analysis of what clinician performance was, because they weren't the same patients, that comparison's not really valid. I think that we like to think that the system is performing at the level of a dermatologist, and that's how we talk about it. I don't think there's any useful sort of direct comparison between the two, although at some point in the future, I'm sure independent studies from us will use technology like ours and make those sorts of comparisons. But for now, I think the important thing is really about, can the AI be sufficiently accurate to be able to augment the existing pipelines and pathways? And that's something that we're very comfortable with. I think from our perspective, the way that you get the most value out of this is by using the artificial intelligence as almost a first filter, so that you can take the haystack, which is patients that are generally healthy, and you've got the needle in there, which is a cancer, and be able to pull out that haystack and make it much, much smaller so that the clinicians can spend their time with the patients that they need to. And maybe in the future, as we get more and more data, we've got ambitions that the AI might be able to split things into 3 piles, where you have the clearly malignant pile that there's no point taking off to a dermatology team separately. It could go through a process where the dermatologist assessment happens at the point of biopsy rather than taking an extra step to get that patient to the point of having it removed. And then you could have the middle part of the stack, which is the ambiguous stuff that definitely needs a clinician to review it. And then you've got the bottom of the pile, which is clearly benign, which can be sent down different pathways. And so we see an evolution of the way you can use this technology. But I think you hit the nail on the head with the question. For us, medicine is just the grayest thing you could imagine. There's like a million shades of it, and it's a very human discipline. And what we're talking about is bringing something that is effectively statistics, it's maths, and we're looking at being able to apply it to creating better patient pathways. But those patient pathways can't exist without clinicians, because the complexity that we just talked about ultimately needs a human to be able to interact with it. And I know we just saw a month ago there was that paper that suggested that ChatGPT had more empathetic responses to patients than actual doctors. And that might be true in that particular situation with the way that doctors are interacting with patients, but interactions aren't medical care either. There are a lot of decisions that need to be made by clinicians with a whole bunch of factors that need to be made. And we spoke to one dermatologist at a point who was telling us you're asking a question whether something has changed, a skin lesion has changed, is one of the most important factors for identifying potential skin cancers, specifically melanoma. And when we looked at the data, and both externally and internally, we could definitely see that was an important variable, but not as important as this clinician was suggesting. And so I was asking them about it. And when they explained, lots of people say that it's changed. And so the data that you'll see will be people saying it's changed and it's having a loose interaction with the malignancy. But when someone says, oh yeah, it's definitely changed, like they know it's changed, then the probability of it being malignant is really high. And a system really struggles to be able to differentiate between an answer of yes, it's changed versus a patient being definitive and absolutely sure it's changed. And those sorts of nuances are thousands of them in clinical care. So I think there's always going to have to be clinicians involved in these pathways to be empathetic and to design the best care for patients. And our challenge is to really figure out how to leverage the AI to build better pathways. And that doesn't mean just augmenting what we've got now, which is what we focus our efforts doing. It means changing the pathways to get the best out of the AI and then get the best out of the clinician.
Sure. I have another question on ethical considerations. The only reason I'm probing on this topic is just because this is obviously a huge talking point at the moment when it comes to AI, and it's probably one of the biggest barriers when it comes to implementing AIs in clinical practice. And so my question is, medicine to treat a patient successfully is part of a multidisciplinary team. You have doctors involved, you have nurses involved, you have physios involved, pharmacists involved, and this whole team is responsible for this patient's care. And so by integrating an AI system like skin analytics into the patient's care, is it fair to say that you guys are taking on some responsibility in treating this patient?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've not tried to shy away from that as a company. we are definitely involved. If you like, I see us almost as another member of the MDT. You're going to have pathologists in there. You're going to have a load of people in that team to make sure that the right care is provided at the right time for the patient. And we see our role as very much a part of that. Now, we can't be a part of that and be actively involved in these patient pathways if we're not willing to assume the responsibility for doing that. And we take that very seriously. We have a very active clinical safety team that effectively integrated into every single thing we do as a company. And that process was quite painful to do over the last sort of 3 or 4 years. And it's been running very effectively for the last couple of years. Ever since we launched actually with UHB, it really is something that is integrated at every level of our business. So we're not shy about saying we're playing a role in this care and we should be held accountable for that. Because otherwise, the value of what we do gets washed out. Because if you can't rely on the AI to be part of that patient pathway, effectively part of that patient pathway, then what's the point of having it? If it's, oh, this is just recommendation and you can't really trust it, or you need to use your own sort of opinion, which is always the case for clinicians. But if the AI is not willing to stand up and be part of that process, then I don't think it's valuable.
Sure. And it is interesting how you guys have integrated into the clinical pathway. I want to talk a bit about this now because having listened to the talk you gave at Intelligent Health Conference with obviously Musty, Big Picture Medicine host, chairing it, it was fascinating because immediately looking at the program, I assumed that the way you would integrate into clinical care would either be through GP practices. You would provide this tool for GPs, and so then they can screen before referring them on to dermatologists, or you provide this tool to dermatologists who would be able to use this to aid the diagnosis. But actually you were talking about its use case in specifically community hubs to improve patient care, which I found a fascinating talking point and something that I don't think is spoken enough about, actually lifting burden from primary care, secondary care, and taking that burden out into the community. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, the way we think about things is there's post 2-week wait referral and pre 2-week wait referral. And right now, we're very much focused on the post 2-week wait referral. So a primary care doctor has assessed the patient, decided that they need an urgent referral, and we work with hospital systems and the primary care organizations to effectively triage and help manage that workflow. Using our technology, we're able to avoid about over 60% of face-to-face appointments, and that really eases the pressure on the dermatology departments. So that's the now. That's the what do we do today to try and ease the pressure on those wait lists and help the dermatology departments increase their capacity to see patients. That's great. We're really proud of that work, and I think that's probably what we're going to see scale across the NHS more quickly in the next little while. What you're referring to is what Nick and I and the rest of the team at Birmingham have been really passionate about for a while, but is the next phase, which is this community diagnostic center work. And the idea there is that if the AI is sufficiently sensitive for finding cancers and specific, so able to reduce the number of unnecessary referrals, then the idea that it can play a role where GPs signpost patients to the community diagnostic hub to have a skin cancer assessment rather than come into the GP office becomes really interesting for the NHS. You can take a huge volume of work off the primary care doctors, allowing them to spend a bit more time with the patients and really focus on the more complex problems. And you could really streamline access to skin cancer assessments, really make it easy for patients to go in there. And so what we've done with Birmingham, very much in a very controlled setting, is deployed these community diagnostic center where GPs can signpost patients. We also won an SBRI Healthcare Cancer Award to do this in 3 other sites across the country, which will get live in the next little while. And what that'll allow us to do, along with an independent evaluation body, is really assess that what we expect to happen in terms of the sensitivity and specificity will be high cancer pickup rate, but without overwhelming secondary care downstream with urgent referrals. And we'll be able to show that, and we'll be able to show the economics of doing these pre-GP or pre-referral community diagnostic hubs. And at that point, we'll be able to start rolling that out across the country. And we're really excited about it. But as usual, we've got this sort of evidence-led approach that we like to follow. So there's a bit of work to do to make sure that these test beds, if you like, really deliver the way we want them to. But as you said, that's the step. That's the part I get so excited about, because that's when you can start saying, okay, in the delivery of the million odd people who go through skin cancer pathways across the UK, what happens to the number of patients who come and get assessed? And then what happens to our cancer detection rate? Is it better? Is it worse? Do we find cancers earlier? All of those things, we strongly believe that we'll be able to reduce the barrier for more people to get skin cancer checks, and then we'll find more of them earlier. But all of that has to play out, obviously, in the data. That's getting us closer to that vision that we talked about earlier that we're really excited about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because of the demand to hit that 2-week wait referral pathway. It has to be done in 2 weeks if it's suspected cancer. A lot of patients with non-life-threatening dermatological conditions, for example psoriasis, aren't getting seen quickly enough, and when they are getting seen, it's a very quick consultation, and it's not managing the whole multifactorial aspect of these skin conditions. With specifically taking psoriasis, for example, we know that it's a huge condition that can affect people's mental well-being as well as their physical well-being. And so it's interesting that these community hubs will allow for cancers to be diagnosed quicker, but also actually allow other patients, non-cancer but dermatological patients, to be treated better.
Yeah, that's right. I think I was really struck by a book written by Alex Anstey, who was an NHS dermatologist. And his opening part of the book, it's called Under the Skin. The opening part of the book, he's talking about how he spends a huge amount of time seeing patients that are healthy to try and find that one cancer. And the hit rate is 6% nationally of the urgent referrals end up having a melanoma and SCC or SCC. So 94 out of 100 patients that these dermatology teams are seeing on these urgent pathways are perfectly healthy. And he talks about spending the whole day doing that. And at the very end of the day, having these chronic psoriasis patients who are in some significant discomfort, of huge impact on their quality of life, that are getting rushed through at the end of the day on the dermatologist's extra time. Basically, them just being committed to their patients and staying beyond the time that they should be going home. And that really hit home. And that was just a really eloquent way of that dermatologist describing something that we've been aware of and have really tried to prioritize fixing, which is patients that are sick and that are known to be sick need to be spending time with clinicians. And the AI that we've built, and AI in general, I think, where it will excel, is helping to weed out patients who aren't sick and get the ones who are sick into doctors' offices. You could almost separate out this identification of sick people, which AI is really good at, from then the treatment of sick people, which humans are really good at. And I think from our point of view, psoriasis, eczema, these are hugely problematic conditions that people aren't getting the care they need. And dermatologists across the country, when we speak to them, are really frustrated about that. So I really hope that's going to be one of the great outcomes of using AI in these pathways, is we're going to see much better care for those patients who don't have life-threatening conditions, but do have conditions that are affecting their quality of life.
Definitely. And so you've mentioned that the next phase is now obviously implementing these community hubs around the UK community diagnostic centres. But if you were to look forward into the next phase of that, would it be to have screening hubs, walk-in hubs, where anyone, let's say they go to the supermarket, you have a skin analytics truck and you can just walk in and get a mole or a lesion checked out that, you know what, you haven't thought it is a big enough deal to actually go to the GP for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and one we think about a lot. There needs to be a balance between ease of access and controlling the quality of the data collection and the result that patients get. And I think from our point of view, we're keen to explore any way that we can have more sites that can collect the data, working with colleagues in medical photography or medical illustrations, depending on which part of the NHS you're referring to. But those sorts of teams are really leading the way in terms of capturing high quality data that is not just useful for the AI, but is also useful for the dermatologist further downstream. And so I think that there's going to need to be focal points to get patients into, whether that's like every pharmacy or however we get to set it up in the future. But there's going to have to be some quality control around making sure the data integrity is there to get the right outcomes for patients. And it goes back to the point you were asking around before, around ethics. We're really committed to making sure that we create conditions for AI to be successful. And that at the moment means that we control a lot of the process and pathways more tightly than is ideal if you were thinking about trying to deploy this technology quickly, but is certainly important for us to maintain that safety profile that we were talking about being critical for us.
Yeah. And if we could speculate now for the next 5 to 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line, what is your vision now for skin analytics? Where do you see the future of AI in dermatology?
Yeah, so we started with skin cancer. Our ambition is to go beyond skin cancer and to look at all the dermatology conditions. I think there's a whole fascinating part of diagnostics is obviously very important in skin cancer. When you get to other skin conditions, the diagnostics is probably less complicated. The response to treatment and managing patients becomes more important. I think there's a huge opportunity to use technology to help better management of patients, from can we help control flare-ups, or can we just make sure that the treatments are effective and help ladder patients up the treatment curve as required, where doctors have more real-time continuous information rather than every 6 weeks or however long it takes for that patient to get back in front of that clinician, those sort of single points of interaction. We want to expand out into all of dermatology. Who knows? I think what we've learned about medical devices, delivering safe systems, changing clinical pathways, which involves a huge amount of change management, I think is applicable to a range of different areas. And we've had some preliminary discussions with other groups around how we could take our skin learnings and apply them to other clinical areas. And so we remain open to that, and we might expand beyond skin at some point. We'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of work to do to get the skin pathways to be where they need to be, and then hopefully we can open up some other areas after that.
Sure. And in terms of addressing barriers to do with AI and its integration in clinical practice, there was a great quote I saw, which, just to summarize it, it was talking about how fear hinders progress, and there is a lot of AI fear at the moment. And what would you say to those who are saying, oh, AI is going to replace the workforce, going to replace the role of a doctor? How would you convince them that, you know what, that's not actually the vision? The role of AI is actually to be an aid, to make the whole system more efficient, rather than actually the replacement of professionals?
Yeah, let me share my view on that and then give some data to back it up. I think what we're seeing across medicine is that the demand for healthcare is just so much bigger than our ability to deliver it against it. You can see in the UK, we have one of the world's most efficient healthcare systems, and it's something to be hugely proud of. I think the NHS is an incredible institution that globally is recognized for the quality of its care and the cost effectiveness of delivering it. But the NHS is very much set up to treat disease, and we've tried to introduce proactive treatment in a bunch of areas, and it's very difficult for the NHS to do that. But if we had more resources, we could definitely start taking proactive steps in that direction and help manage patients before they become patients in some respects. And from our perspective, we're talking about a very small slice that AI is appropriate for in clinical care right now. That might be different in 10 years' time when these language models have had enough time to mature and become medical devices in their own right. But right now, there are relatively small slivers that we're talking about that are just not going to affect the amount of work the clinicians have to do. We think that, I think there's a great famous quote out there now, which is radiologists, it was focused on them, but radiologists shouldn't fear AI. They should fear radiologists using AI. And I think that's true of all clinicians, because you can design better pathways and become better clinicians if you adopt and embrace the technology. And we think that's the case certainly in dermatology. And just for a bit of data, and again, this is US based, I just found it fascinating. There was a report, I think it was published in JAMA, and it was saying that if you could increase dermatologist density per 100,000 head of population by 25%, you saw a 600% increase in utilization of dermatology services. So it gives you some sense that there's a huge latent demand that we're not servicing right now. And I think that the reality is that our dermatology services and other healthcare services disciplines are going to fall in a heap in the next 5 years if we don't start adopting with this technology. So yeah, again, I don't think that the concern is that AI is going to take over. I think the concern is that we continue to deliver world-class care.
Sure, great answer there. And as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, so speaking to different successful entrepreneurs and founders, I love asking the question, is there any inspiring advice you can give the listeners and audience? And I always get two different responses. One is this motivational speech, and then the other one is quite real and honest, that, you know what, just they don't really have any top tips to give you, but here's what worked for me. So which one are you there?
I'm both. I think we should be very cognizant of the fact that one person's experience is one person's experience. And we've been a company that have battled this out. It's been 10 years. We're not an overnight success, although we hope to be seen as one, even if it takes 10 years. But it's a long path. And there are founders out there who've built companies that have exploded in 3 or 4 years, and they would have a very different view of this. My personal perspective on this is that it's the most rewarding job that you could possibly have, but it's also the job that takes its pound of flesh. And it's just like clinical medicine. It's a very rewarding job, but it's very demanding, and it comes with a price. And I think the thing that you need above anything else is resilience, and you need a passion for what you're doing. Now, having a passion for what you're doing is probably the secret to having a happy life, really, isn't it? Because you spend so much of your life working. If you don't like it, you're doing the wrong thing. You need to go out and find that thing that you do. So that one's easy. The resilience part is a little bit harder. You get knocked down 1,000 times and have to get back up. But every single entrepreneur that I've ever met, there's no feature that I have seen across all entrepreneurs except for resilience. Like, everyone comes from different walks of life. There's no perfect entrepreneur. There's no skill set that you need to have apart from resilience and a passion for what you do.
Great answer there. So Neil, it's been amazing having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'm really impressed by what you're doing. I think being someone who can educate and communicate about clinical care and what's happening and helping especially med students access information, I think is absolutely essential, and I really applaud your efforts, and I really enjoyed chatting to you.
Thank you so much. It's been an amazing extension of our conversation that we initially had a couple of weeks ago in London. But yeah, great to finally actually probably sit down with you, Neil, and we should definitely stay in touch.